Hello and welcome back to another episode of Ardent Talks. My name is Pascal Talbot and I'm an assistant project manager in the consents management team, and I'm really excited to be hosting this podcast today where we'll be discussing lessons from the front line and what consent management has taught us. Joining me today we have Dr. Jim Doyle and Mr. Matthew Anderson, who I asked to introduce themselves. So without further ado, Jim, over to you. Could you start off by introducing yourself, when you joined Ardent, and a bit about your role in the consents management team?
Yes, afternoon, Pascal. So my name's Jim. I joined consents management in November 2023. Before that, I'd largely worked in the energy sector for about 20 years. What do I do in consents management? I do quite a lot of business development, so working with clients to understand what they want us to do, how we can help them, how we can try and move their projects forwards. And then I do quite a lot of project management work. So actually working on projects, moving the projects through from project inception, hopefully through to getting an application in for a consent, whatever that consent may be, and then moving the project forwards into execution.
Wow. Okay, so your role entails quite a lot then, Jim. Okay, so over to you, Matt. Can you start off by introducing yourself, when you joined Ardent, and a bit about your role in the team?
Yeah, perfect. I mean, I'm not going to match Jim by any means in terms of levels of experience, to be honest. So I'm Matt. I joined Ardent in February 2022, teaming up with Vicky in the consents management. My role in the team, I'm a project manager, started as an assistant project manager, now working on a carbon capture scheme up in the Peak District, which is challenging. I've got a secondary consenting background, probably just over a decade. I think it's about 11 years in consenting. I don't like to remind myself too much. But that was sort of started out in way leave easements, freehold leasehold purchase rights, progressed into sort of flood defence, consenting, highways excavation licences, and multiple other secondary consents. My first DCO was when I joined Ardent, went on to Lower Thames Crossing, worked on Vattenfall, which is now RWE's offshore wind farm, and supported Ørsted, now moving on to, as I say, to the Peak Cluster scheme. So my skill set lies in people management, and I really like driving problem solving and efficiencies. We're sitting in a sort of DCO delivery lead role, so sort of mimicking what Jim's saying. We're sort of looking at that DCO process, looking at the work streams, integration, what those key milestones are for the project, how do we get there, what does that look like, feeding into sort of key control documents and so forth.
Okay, and when you first joined consents, Matt, what would you say surprised you the most?
Where do I start? No, I think for me, it's covering quite a lot. I mean, it was a bit of a sort of in at the deep end piece, starting off in the boots on the ground piece, in the way leave and easement. It's underestimated how much work has to go into notifying those affected by a lot of the work. When you get into consent management, a lot of the focus can be sort of desk-based work, but actually the boots on the ground, the people that are out there having these conversations and these negotiations, the level of detail and the work that has to go into records of condition, crop compensation, keeping in the loop, whether they have a land agent, and it's getting that point across every time. To me, that really surprised me, along with the aspect of consents constantly being on the critical path, whether that's secondary or primary in terms of, DCOs. We have that element of a lot of pressure sits on the delivering of that consent and those key constraints and statutory timeframes that we have to progress through. So that was probably the most surprising with me. I'm sure, Jim, you've probably got that and more.
Yeah, what would you say your views are on that, Jim?
I think for me, the most surprising thing has been, the number of different elements and disciplines which need to be aligned in order to make a successful and coherent planning application. So across, say, the environmental impact assessment, as an example, you've got so many different skill sets there, so many different people that you have to talk to and hopefully get agreement with in order to make sure that your application is a strong one, is a robust one. There's a huge amount of work that goes into getting all of that information and data together, making sense of it. And I guess one of the surprising things is that sometimes some of those EIA disciplines can almost be at odds with each other. One may be driving you in one direction, the other EIA specialist may be driving you in a slightly different direction. So, when you're maybe asked to mitigate a certain impact, that mitigation inherently may have an impact on another of the EIA disciplines, if that makes sense. It's a really difficult challenge to keep abreast of all of those different disciplines, advise the client on what they should be thinking about or should be doing, or the action they should be taking in order to get to a consent or a consent application which is ready and fit for purpose and does what it needs to do for the client. I guess the other surprise for me is that, when we talk about protected species, which people may assume are reasonably rare, they seem to be fairly common, particularly on sites earmarked for development.
Yeah, that does definitely come up a lot. Okay, and for those listening who don't know what consent management is, what would you say consent management actually means in practice?
To put it into terminology that I probably needed to get my head around, I'm not someone that deals particularly well with the technical abbreviations, acronyms and jargon that comes with it. But to me, consent management is an umbrella term for what is a process of stages. Now, obviously, this is open to interpretation, but it starts out of that need for the project, documentation build out, all the way through. On the back end of the consents management, you have that commitments and adherence to the consent during construction phases, operational phases, and then within that, you've the sort of stakeholder management piece, keeping people informed, whether that's internally, externally, and then when it comes to that sort of handover of the product, is what we've consented fit for purpose? Has it met the objectives that it had set out initially in that sort of project inception and business case piece? So yeah, to me, that's what it means in practice. It's, here's an idea, this is how we take it through, is what we've built aligning to what the idea was and the reason for this project.
Yeah. And Jim, what would you say, in your experience, what consent management means in practice?
I think much of what we do, certainly in pre-application, is making sure that what is being applied for is exactly what the client actually wants to consent and build, and something that we need to test. We need to test that really robustly to check that what we are looking to consent is what the client wants. It's a really simple question to ask at the beginning of the process and at sort of project inception. What do you need? And then actually, what do you think you might need? So something that the client may rely on later actually gets captured within that consent. I think the other thing we do within consent management is that integration function. So making sure that we have an integrated approach across all of those disparate work streams, such as land, legal, engineering, environmental, project management, that across all of those functions, we have a coherent application and a coherent set of documents that eventually get submitted, hopefully leading to a positive decision and a successful project.
Yeah, definitely. And what would you say the biggest lessons you've personally learned from working in consents management?
Where do I start? I think there's a few on this one. Probably for me is quite early on, I was very, for want of a better phrase, green behind the ears. And whether that's, someone supporting on a project that I was involved in, someone having a conversation with a landowner that I was involved in my absence, whether that was leave or being on another call or elsewhere, is don't assume it's been done. I think I got caught out a couple of times, particularly in my early days, around assumptions. Well, I thought you'd done that. Well, no, that's your job. Oh, well, the conversation of back and forth goes until one of us gives in. Unfortunately, it was me a lot of the time. Also, communication is something I bang on about. Pascal, you've heard me talk about this. Jim's heard me talk about it on our current project. On and on and on do I keep banging on about communication. It really sits at the core. I mean, our sort of remit sits around project management, and then that project management, feeds quite nicely and dovetails well into sort of the consent management piece. So for me, the real key sits in that PM triangle is communication. We've got the cost, quality and time element, but I like to always scribble in there communication, because if we're not communicating about the outer sides of the triangle, we're not getting anywhere. And that spreads across the whole project. The assumption that someone spoke to someone, the assumption that this work stream has spoke to that work stream, the lessons learned for me, I've dealt with councils in the past where after visiting their offices, I realised they were sitting back to back, internal departments sitting back to back, but they're not communicating. And it's so important that when we're speaking to one and the other, that we make sure that connection's been made. So for me, don't assume communication and that interface management piece. Someone has to bring these teams together, probably within the consent management. That sits quite nicely with our PM function elements of what we do is, I like to call it the filler between the cracks. And it's something I actually enjoy doing. So
Yeah, no, I can agree with that, Matt. I can agree with that. It definitely is, bringing people out of that silo working, isn't it? And
absolutely.
just getting everyone around a table, making sure everything's aligning the way it should.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, don't assume. I can definitely relate to that. So, Jim, what would you say the biggest lessons you've personally learned?
I'm just thinking about Matt's example, and he's right. There are organizations where you could have people that your colleagues might be dealing with on a day-to-day basis that sit right next to each other, dealing with the same project, but not actually talking to each other. It does happen. It sounds sort of counterintuitive, but it does happen. And I've seen it happen. So yeah, that's a really good point. It's not just about communication within your own work environment or your own team. It's actually making sure that perhaps stakeholders are informed and communicating with each other, and they know who you are talking to. So it's a really good point. I guess for me, we deal with really complex projects that are multifaceted, huge costs involved. And I think for me, the learning point is no two projects are ever the same. There are always going to be different issues that you end up dealing with. On the face of it, projects may seem similar, even identical, but inherently the locations where those projects are being built out will be different. The stakeholders will be different, and they'll have different drivers, and your clients' expectations will be different. No two projects are ever the same, which sometimes can be a bit frustrating, but actually that's part of the challenge, getting to understand the project and making it work for the client. I guess the other key lesson for me is understanding what the client actually wants to achieve and why. I think it's really crucial that as many people within the project team understands what is driving the client to do what they are asking you to do. What is it about their business, about their project, which is so critically important that they are asking you to get on and do it? That means a lot. And it's an important thing to keep coming back to, because that question about why they're doing it, when they're doing it, can change. And things that might change that might be because we end up being in pre-application for sometimes a number of years. It's possible that pre-application phase might cover different government administrations. So policy can change, the political landscape can change, the drivers for the project can change. So it's a really important point to keep coming back to the client to ask the question, why do you want to do what you want to do? And when do you want to do it? The client might think, well, why are you asking me the same question again and again? Those drivers can change.
Yeah, I definitely think it's important to ask, the what, where, when, how, why. Just ask questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I do agree with that one.
Yeah, thank you, Jim, for sharing that. And Matt, can you share an example of a situation, that kind of really tested you or the team and what it's taught you?
Do you know what? I promise I won't be one of those people that brings up the same example every time. But I really do think it's underestimated how important communication is. And I promise I'll try not to say the word after I finish talking about this one.
No, but you're right, though. Communication is so important.
Yeah. Talking about a previous program before I joined Ardent of Works, it really interesting, great team. It's the first integrated delivery team I'd worked with. We're all in the same office. That in itself was such a benefit. But again, essentially, we were replacing flood defences along the Thames and Thames estuary. For anyone that doesn't know, on the north and south of the Thames, you've got the Thames Pathway, which pretty much covers the whole length of the Thames from north down to south. It's a public right of way, so it's the best part of 2 meters wide, sometimes more, sometimes shorter. But any works you do on a flood wall, you had to close it out. You had to. And for me, it was a really testing time. We're dealing with multiple London boroughs. Some work some way, some work the other. And your working area, you're having to find, different mechanisms, different ways of working in terms of construction. We were using stuff called, I don't know whether they've changed now, but it used to be called dead men's trolleys, which is essentially the weight of the person going over onto the wall had to be counteracted by almost like a sack barrow of weight on the other side, because there was just no room. It was a really testing time. You're having to constantly try and look for different areas of working. It was very complex, different ways of working, different plant, different whatever you can, just to try and reduce the shutting of the footpath, because we all know how frustrating it is, whether it's a local road or a local footpath that we use daily. So to me, yeah, that was a really testing time. a new project come in and you're almost sitting there thinking, okay, so what part of the pathway am I going to have to close this time? If you were lucky, you might have got a park or a garden next to it to work with him. But yeah, that was probably the most testing time. What did it teach me? I think it very much taught me is to keep every London borough highways department on speed dial, because the likelihood is I'd probably be calling them up again in a short space of time.
Just memorise that number.
Me again.
Thanks, Matt. And Jim, can you also share an example of, something that's really tested you and what it taught you?
I think for me, a good example, myself and a colleague, when I was working at a power station site, we were asked to join the managing director of the power station in his office. And he asked us to hit a very specific deadline for a DCO application, which was aligned with a commercial driver. And that deadline was incredibly tight. And DCOs tend to be quite organic in terms of the process. You can't short circuit some of the processes that you need to go through. But in order to hit this deadline, it really did require a very different approach to be taken, and inherently sort of looking at the sort of risk versus reward metrics on the project. But we managed to hit the deadline, which was a real achievement for everybody. What did it teach me? I think for me, it taught me that if you have sort of clear direction and a real willingness and the right team and a client who's willing to talk openly about that risk and reward metric, it's possible to achieve what at the time might have seemed, quite impossible. So yes, I mean, anything is doable. It just requires the right approach, the right mindset, the right team in order to do it. I guess one more example, which was a real test, was we had a key stakeholder had raised some concerns about the draft documentation we generated. And the documentation in question was fairly pivotal to the project's validity. And this meant having to delay the submission. But the instruction given by senior management was just to submit it, just get on with it. We have to hit the target. So I just want you to submit the application, without really understanding what the risk involved was in terms of submitting an application where a key stakeholder was not happy. The risk being that effectively the planning inspectorate potentially asked you, the applicant, to withdraw the application. And the criticality of this couldn't really be overstated. So this would have been a really public issue had the application then been submitted and then withdrawn. So it was really important to sort of stand your ground and say, look, please understand what you are asking me to do here. And the implications are significant. And eventually, we got to a landing where, okay, let's not submit. Let's get to a position where we can sort the situation out with the stakeholder. We can get to a landing with them and submit the application with a greater degree of certainty that it would be accepted.
Okay, so I suppose it's also providing them with some sort of guidance, isn't it, about the implications it may cause?
Absolutely. So we often are dealing with clients who maybe don't understand the process, don't understand the scheme, maybe and inherently don't understand the risk involved to their project. And you're right, there's an education piece there, which inherently is incumbent on us to undertake and help the client understand what the process means, how it works, how it functions, and why some of these stakeholders are absolutely necessary to engage with. And again, it comes back to, I guess, Matt's communication piece is making sure that communication is the correct communication, it's effective, and hopefully sort of drives the project forwards in a positive way.
Yeah, definitely.
I'd just like to say I didn't say that word. Jim said that word, just for anyone listening.
Communication?
Yeah, I hope you can differentiate between mine and Jim.
What word, Matt?
No, I'm not saying it.
Okay, so thank you, Jim, for sharing that. So how do you think consents management has shaped the way you approach challenges in general?
Challenges in general? I mean, it's a good question. I mean, firstly, it's probably asking loads of questions. Any challenges I face, whether that's in personal as well as working life, is asking questions around the subject, asking yourself the questions around the challenge. What is this challenge? Firstly, what can I do about it? Does that sit with me? Understanding what it is, what is the challenge? And maybe someone's dealt with that challenge before. Is there any previous experience in dealing with it? And I think that's where we need to sort of like address sort of misconceptions around having experience in absolutely everything. For me, it's very rare that, like Jim was saying earlier about the project piece, that in itself, if you're coming onto a new project, not every project is the same. That in itself is a challenge. And I think it's getting our head around the fact that we can be experts in fields, but we don't necessarily have to be experts in absolutely everything. And it's something that I've really had to battle with as a challenge is when someone's talking about something and I don't understand, I'm sort of like questioning myself, well, why don't I understand this? I need to understand this. And sometimes you have to draw a line between what you need to know and what you don't need to know, because if you're trying to take on too much, that in itself can be quite overwhelming. So I think for me, it's stepping back, understanding what that challenge is, what can I do about it now, and is there any other support out there for it?
And I suppose there's also an aspect to it, isn't there, of kind of looking at what has worked before, what hasn't worked,
Absolutely.
which can kind of, change the way you approach new projects or
Yeah.
anything new that comes up. And Jim, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, not dissimilar to Matt's, really. I think you're right. The consent management sphere is so broad in terms of you cannot be an expert in everything. You just can't. So it's knowing when to say, okay, I need to phone someone up. I need to get in contact with somebody else because fundamentally I don't understand what I'm being asked to deal with here. And that's not a criticism. That's not a bad thing. It's knowing where your skill set lies and someone else's skill set actually lies, and how you make the most of their expertise. I suppose the other thing I think consent management's taught me is about looking at the art of the possible and coming back to that question of what is it you think you may need, and getting everything on the table that may be required, and then removing what is simply not possible. You take away what cannot be consented, you take away what you are absolutely sure you're not going to need, and then hopefully you're left with something which is consentable and may be required. So looking at sort of that optionality, approaching things with that mindset of what can actually be done with the resource or the time that you're given, I think that's a really useful mindset and approach to take to most sort of project management problems.
Yeah, I agree. And I think for me as well, I think our team's at 13 now in our team. And I think out of all of us, there's such a wide range of experience throughout the team. So if one person's, unsure of something in an area, then there's always someone else to kind of fall back on and to get that sort of guidance, which is always quite nice and is really helpful. Okay, so Jim, what would you say your proudest moment working in consent so far is?
I think something you have to accept from a project management or consenting perspective is that not all projects that you work on are going to get built. Part of the job is getting a consent, but they may never get built. So actually seeing a project built out that I had some involvement or engagement in, that's very rewarding. It's really sort of, I suppose, reassuring to see that something that you've worked on and you've put a lot of effort and time into actually pays dividend and does get constructed and will operate. I guess the other thing for me is getting positive feedback from colleagues and consultants I've worked with. That means an awful lot, certainly when you're working with people on long project days and sometimes long lights into the evening, or having sort of spent days in drafty village halls when undertaking consultation events with people who maybe rather not be communicating with. Yeah, I think those are the things which mean a lot.
Yeah, I think feedback is a top one for me. Getting good feedback, it definitely does make you feel proud of what you've done. So yeah, I agree with you there, Jim. And Matt, what's your proudest moment so far?
Do you know what? I think it's going to piggyback off what Jim said. For me, I'm quite a results-driven person, again, within work and outside of work. I like to see the fruits of my labour, seeing something built, and coming back to what Jim was saying, I think when you're in the consent management process, you have these short spells of results, but that grand result of seeing that consent, not only through the process to submission and hopefully a positive decision, but also to see that the outcome aligning to what was originally put through in the business case to be consented is up there. Also, I think for me, it's the network. Something that for me I'm really proud of is just having a really good network of experienced people. Some people I've worked on projects with once or twice, sometimes more than that. Still keeping in touch outside of projects, how things are going, even just bouncing ideas off, obviously removing the element of conflict of interest. But for me, I'm really much, I like to get stuck in with people, managing teams. So for me, I think my proudest moment is when I can sort of get in, help teams out, see the results of that sort of bringing people together, feeding in, getting that consent across the line. Has it been granted in a positive way? Yes, it has. I mean, to me, everyone wins at that point. So that's probably my proudest moment, and that's a consistent moment. Every project I go in is a new team, potentially with similar faces. So it's always moving.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to bring that word up again, Matt, but I mean, your communication skills,
I'm not saying it.
you should be very proud of those. Okay, so Matt, if you could give advice to someone new in the field, what would you say?
Ask questions.
Yeah.
Loads and loads and loads of questions, whether you think they're simple or not. Just ask questions, because the likelihood is someone else in the room around the table is thinking it but not saying it. And I think we need to eliminate this aura of not being able to ask what could be visual as a simple question or an easy question, because sometimes those simple questions actually throw a bit of a spanner in the works, and they become topics of conversation. I think that would be one. Listening, particularly in the role we're in. And I think I can speak for everyone on this call, the fact that we are pivotal in bringing teams together. So just listen to everything, because that small nugget of information may crop up later down the line, and flagging that could be the difference between quite a serious or major decision. And probably my biggest one here is never assume. I covered it in the first point you asked. Never assume something's been done. Always ask the question. There's a link there. Questions, assumptions. Always ask the question. That's not to put anyone off either.
Yeah, no, but I agree. I do agree with you, Matt, especially what you're saying about, I've had times when I've been in a meeting and there's questions and you don't really want to ask a question in case it may necessarily sound silly. But then you ask the question, then it does get everyone thinking. And, I think 9 times out of 10, everyone's probably actually thinking, oh, I want to ask that question, but they don't.
And do you know what? And I think just jumping off the back of that, I've had it before. You start to get those little elements of imposter syndrome kicking in, like, oh, am I in the right place here? But something I've always had to remind myself is, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're probably in the wrong room. I'll let people take away what they want from that one. But yeah, if you're not the smartest person in the room, I like myself a lot of the time, you're in the right room because you're learning. That's the way I read that.
Yeah, it's a journey. Okay, thank you, Matt. And Jim, what advice would you give to someone new in the field?
I think the example is a good one. Always ask questions. I'd say the same thing. And part of the job and the role we play is to ask those what might appear to be simple, basic questions, and which inherently you end up finding that actually there isn't a simple answer, or there isn't an answer at all. And then you recognize actually that there's something here that needs sorting out. So I think you're right. I think that's one of the most important things, is to ask those basic questions, because you end up sometimes asking the same questions again and again and again. And sometimes you find actually the answer you get is different. It's okay, well, why am I getting a different answer now? And there may be a very good reason for it. It sounds simple, but it's not. And Matt's right. Sometimes I guess it's how you ask the question, and also having the belligerence to keep asking the question until you get a satisfactory answer. And it's important to recognise that you're doing this for the benefit of the project and the client. You're not doing it to be difficult or bloody minded. You're doing it because you need to understand this stuff. The role we tend to play is to make sure that the application being made or the project is fit for purpose, is a robust one. It's almost our job to make sure that those questions have a satisfactory answer. So yeah, it's really important to ask them. Just building on Matt's analogy, the other analogy I would suggest is that if everyone's thinking the same way, somebody's not doing their job.
And I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, Jim, about, like no project is the same, no day is the same in consents in that matter. And, you can't approach every situation thinking it's going to be the same sort of outcome. So yeah, questions, definitely. I think questions they're definitely a key takeaway there. What excites you about where we're heading as a team, Matt?
I think for me, it's the diversity of sectors that we're working across now as a team. As you said earlier, Pascal, we're up to a team of 13. We're covering various different sectors now. I know Jim's probably got a list of what those sectors are, so I'll let him cover that off. But I think for me, it's the growing of the team, the breadth of experience we've got across multiple sectors, different industries, different backgrounds. And I think the beauty in consents management and the project management collaboration there is a lot of the team have got that diversification in backgrounds before coming into consent management. Is certainly something I hadn't thought about. My background being in environment sort of helped shape elements of where I've progressed in. I know you've got a background in property, Pascal, haven't you? So again, it's that, the valuation, the numbers.
Exactly. Everyone's bringing in something new.
Absolutely. And I think for me, as the team grows, as the sector grows, hopefully, the positive reputation continues to grow. That's sort of what I like, where you get to a point where you are wanted as a consultant.
Amazing, Matt. Thank you. And Jim, what would you say excites you about where we're heading?
I mean, Matt's right that we are getting engaged now in more and more different industrial sectors. We're engaged in projects which are genuinely groundbreaking. So, as Matt mentioned, we're involved in hydrogen, carbon capture schemes, transport, energy, and a number of these projects are projects which are now regularly making the news. You often hear, people from those industrial sectors talking about the projects that they're engaged with. And that really brings a sense of excitement and satisfaction that the projects we're involved with, the work we are doing, is really newsworthy and something to shout about. And okay, we're a relatively small team, but we are involved in huge infrastructure projects, which is really great, really exciting to be involved with.
Yeah, and Jim, I think you're absolutely right on that. And also coming back to the news element, I think it also adds a sense of responsibility of doing the right thing, particularly being in the news. You're in the public remit, you're in the you're on TV, you're in newspapers, you're on people's phones. I think it's making sure that what we're delivering, we are considering the wider impacts on communities, the economic benefits and environmental impacts. There's so much, as you say earlier, around the work streams, and that responsibility that comes with working on these projects is making sure we're doing the right thing.
Definitely. Yeah. No, I agree. I agree with all of that. Thank you, Jim, for sharing. So, lastly, if consent management was a sport, which one would it be and why?
I'm going to jump to Jim on this. I reckon he's got a good one on this. Go on, Jim.
Yeah. Okay. So we struggle to think of just a single sport which kind of was like an analogy for consent management. Do you know that I think somewhere in England where they roll that cheese down the hill and everyone runs after that cheese? And there's a big long sort of line of people that suddenly throw themselves down this hill, trying to chase the cheese, which I guess the analogy being that is the consent that you're after. And occasionally people come away with bumps and bruises and broken bones. So that's the best we could come up with, Pascal.
I like it. Chasing a rolling cheese.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and for anyone that's been for an examination, and to be honest, other aspects of the DCO process knows that when you come to the end of that examination in that decision period, do feel a bit battered and bruised. So there's absolutely no way I can compete with what Jim's put forward as a sport. I had written down squash and tennis because you're constantly batting the ball back and forth. You're trying to get the ball out of your court in the right way as quick as you can. But I think the cheese analogy, I can picture it in my head. People tumbling down the hill left, right and centre. People getting up with arms behind their back. I mean, it's just...
Yeah. I mean, I love that one.
Yeah, I think that nails it.
Well, I mean, you had me at cheese, Jim. You had me at cheese. Well, thanks, guys. That's all we have time for on today's podcast, A Lesson from the Front Line. We've covered some big takeaways from challenges to how the team has adapted and skills that will carry us forward. A huge thank you to Jim and Matt for sharing your stories and insights today, and thank you to everyone listening. Make sure to get in touch with us and ask questions if you wish to do so. And I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now. Thank you.